The autumn of 1853 painted Boston in shades of amber and rust, but nowhere did the colors burn more vividly than in the garden of the Hargrove mansion. Perched atop Beacon Hill like a crown jewel, the estate commanded a view of the bustling harbor below, where merchant ships brought prosperity to the growing city. Yet, it was not the mansion's grandeur that drew whispered conversations in the taverns of the North End, but rather the impossible beauty of Eleanor Hargrove's garden. Samuel Crowley adjusted his wool coat against the October chill as he stood at the wrought iron gates, his journalist's eye taking in every detail. The flowers that bloomed within defied nature itself, roses the color of fresh blood, lilies so white they seemed to glow in the fading daylight, and dahlias with petals that shifted from deep purple to midnight black. Even as winter approached, the garden flourished with an intensity that made the other Beacon Hill estates appear barren by comparison. "You're the third reporter this month to come sniffing around," came a gravelly voice from behind him. Samuel turned to find Thomas Murphy, an Irish dock worker whose weathered face spoke of years battling Boston's harsh winters. The man's eyes held a wariness that went beyond the typical suspicion of the working class toward the press. "Thomas Murphy, isn't it?" Samuel extended his hand. "I'm Samuel Crowley from the Boston Herald. I understand you've lived in this neighborhood for some time." Murphy's calloused hand gripped Samuel's briefly before pulling away. "Long enough to know when something ain't right. You writing about the disappearances?" "What disappearances?" Samuel's pulse quickened, though he kept his voice steady. Murphy glanced toward the mansion, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. 3 people in as many months, all last seen walking these very streets after dark. The constables, they say folks just moved on. You know how it is with the Irish and the poor. But I knew Mary O'Brien since she was a lass. She wouldn't have left without telling her sister." Samuel pulled out his leather notebook, the pages already filled with preliminary research about the Hargrove family. "Tell me about Mary O'Brien." "Seamstress. Worked for some of the fine ladies on the hill. Last anyone saw her, she was walking home from the Pemberton house, right past these gates. That was September 15th, the night of the full moon." Murphy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And I swear on my mother's grave. The next morning those roses were redder than I'd ever seen them." The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone interrupted their conversation. A black brougham approached, its brass fittings gleaming despite the overcast sky. As it passed through the gates, Samuel caught a glimpse of the passenger, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back severely, her pale blue eyes meeting his for just a moment before the carriage disappeared up the winding drive. "Eleanor Hargrove," Murphy muttered, crossing himself. "The lady of the house. Been tending that garden for nigh on 20 years, ever since her husband passed. Some say she talks to the flowers like they're her children." Samuel studied the mansion's Gothic revival architecture, noting the way the shadows seemed to cling to its corners, even in daylight. "What do you know about the family's history?" "Old money came over from England in the 1790s, made their fortune in shipping and textiles. But there's always been talk." Murphy hesitated, glancing around as if the very walls might be listening. "My grandmother, God rest her soul, she used to clean for the previous generation. Said there were rooms in that house that were never to be entered, and that the garden had been there long before any mansion was built. The Hargroves just inherited it." A church bell tolled in the distance, marking the hour. Samuel noticed how the sound seemed muffled here, as if the very air around the estate absorbed noise differently. "There's something else," Murphy continued, his voice barely audible now. "The night Mary disappeared, I was walking home late from O'Malley's tavern. I heard singing coming from the garden, a woman's voice, but not like any hymn I'd ever heard. It was in a language I couldn't place, and it made my skin crawl. When I looked through the gates, I saw lights moving between the flower beds, like someone carrying lanterns in a procession." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Did you report this to the constables?" Murphy let out a bitter laugh. You think they'd believe an Irishman's word against one of Beacon Hill's finest families? The Hargroves have influence that reaches into every corner of this city. The mayor himself dines at their table. As if summoned by their conversation, the front door of the mansion opened and a figure emerged onto the columned portico. Even at this distance, Samuel could see it was a woman in a dark dress, her movements deliberate as she descended the steps toward the garden. She carried something in her hands, a watering can that caught the last rays of sunlight. She tends to them every evening, Murphy observed. Rain or shine, summer or winter, never misses a day. Samuel watched as Eleanor Hargrove moved among the flower beds with practiced grace, stopping at each plant as if greeting an old friend. There was something almost ritualistic about her movements, a precision that spoke of long-established routine. I need to get closer, Samuel murmured, more to himself than to Murphy. I'd think twice about that if I were you, Murphy warned. The last reporter who got too curious about the Hargroves ended up floating in the harbor. Officially ruled a suicide, but he'd been asking the same questions you are now. The implications of Murphy's words settled over Samuel like a shroud. He thought of his editor's assignment, a simple piece about Boston's most beautiful gardens for the society pages. What had seemed like a pleasant diversion from the usual political reporting was revealing itself to be something far more sinister. As darkness began to fall, gas lamps flickered to life along Beacon Street, casting dancing shadows through the iron gates. The garden took on an otherworldly quality in the lamplight, the flowers seeming to pulse with their own inner radiance. The full moon's tomorrow night, Murphy said quietly. If you're determined to investigate, that's when you'll see the truth. But mark my words, Mr. Crowley, some truths are better left buried. With that warning hanging in the air, Murphy tipped his cap and disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that the Hargrove garden held secrets that went far deeper than unusual horticulture. As he walked back toward his boarding house in the North End, Samuel couldn't shake the image of Eleanor Hargrove moving among her flowers with such tender care. There had been something in her movements, something that reminded him of a mother tucking her children into bed. But what kind of mother, he wondered, would nurture her garden with such devotion while people vanished from the very streets outside her gates? The question would haunt him through the night, along with the memory of those impossibly vibrant blooms that seemed to glow with a light that had nothing to do with the sun. The next morning brought a grey drizzle that seemed to seep into Samuel's bones as he made his way through the narrow streets of the North End. His investigation had kept him awake most of the night, poring over old newspaper archives and city records in his cramped boarding house room. What he'd discovered had only deepened the mystery surrounding the Hargrove family. The record showed a pattern stretching back decades, unexplained disappearances that coincided with the lunar cycle, always occurring within a mile radius of the Beacon Hill estate. Yet each case had been dismissed by authorities with explanations that grew increasingly thin upon examination. Runaways, suicides, accidents, all convenient conclusions that avoided deeper investigation. Samuel's first stop was the Quincy Market, where servants from the grand houses often gathered to purchase supplies for their employers. He'd learned that information flowed more freely among the working class, who saw and heard things their betters preferred to ignore. He found his target near the fish stalls, a young woman with prematurely grey streaks in her brown hair, her hands red and chapped from years of hard labor. Margaret Finch had worked as a scullery maid for the Hargroves for 3 years, according to his sources, before abruptly leaving their employ just 2 weeks prior. Miss Finch? Samuel approached carefully, noting how she startled at the sound of her name. I'm Samuel Crowley from the Boston Herald. I was hoping you might speak with me about your time working for the Hargrove family. Margaret's eyes darted nervously around the crowded market before settling on his face. I don't know nothing about nothing, she said quickly. but her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Samuel assured her, pulling a silver dollar from his pocket. "I'm simply trying to understand more about the family for a story I'm writing. Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private?" The sight of the coin seemed to war with her fear. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded toward a small tavern at the edge of the market. "O'Brien's, but just for a few minutes." The tavern was nearly empty at this early hour, filled with the smell of stale ale and pipe tobacco. They settled into a corner booth where the shadows would hide their conversation from prying eyes. "You worked in the Hargrove house for 3 years," Samuel began gently. "That's quite a long time. They must have been good employers." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Good employers don't make their servants sign papers saying they'll never speak of what they see in the house. Good employers don't have rooms that are locked to everyone but the mistress herself." Samuel leaned forward, his journalist's instincts sharpening. "What kind of rooms?" "There's a cellar beneath the garden," Margaret whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Mrs. Hargrove goes down there every night after she tends to the flowers. I seen her through the kitchen window, carrying that watering can and sometimes other things." "What other things?" Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the ale Samuel had bought her. "Bundles, wrapped in cloth. They'd be heavy, I could tell by how she carried them. And they'd leave stains on her dress, dark stains that she'd burn the next morning rather than try to wash clean." The implications of her words sent a chill through Samuel. "Did you ever see what was in these bundles?" "I tried not to look too close," Margaret admitted, "but once when I was emptying the ash from the fireplace in her study, I found something that hadn't burned completely. It was a piece of fabric, blue cotton, like what the working girls wear, and there was hair caught in it, long red hair." Samuel thought of Murphy's description of Mary O'Brien, the missing seamstress. "Did you report this to anyone?" "To who?" Margaret's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "Mrs. Hargrove, she's got connections everywhere. The police chief dines at her table once a month. The mayor's wife is in her garden club. And the servants who've tried to speak out before, well, they don't work in Boston anymore. If they work anywhere at all. What made you finally leave?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into her ale as if the amber liquid might hold answers. "It was 2 weeks ago, the night of the last full moon. I was supposed to be asleep in the servants' quarters, but I heard the singing again." "Singing?" "Mrs. Hargrove, she sings when she works in the garden at night. But it's not like any song you'd hear in church. It's older, darker, makes your teeth ache just to listen to it." Margaret shuddered at the memory. "That night I couldn't help myself. I crept down to the kitchen and looked out the window." Samuel waited, sensing that whatever she'd seen had been the final straw that drove her from the house. "She wasn't alone," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There were others in the garden with her, figures in dark robes, moving between the flower beds in a circle. And in the center—" She stopped, her face pale. "What was in the center, Margaret?" "A man, young, maybe 25. He was tied to a stake that I'd never seen before, like it had grown up from the ground itself. He was alive when they started, but he wasn't making any sound. His mouth was moving like he was trying to scream, but nothing came out." Samuel felt his stomach turn. "What did they do to him?" "Mrs. Hargrove, she had a knife, old-looking thing, with symbols carved into the handle. She cut him, just small cuts at first, letting the blood drip onto the soil around the roses. And as the blood hit the ground, I swear the flowers started to glow brighter." The tavern suddenly felt too warm, too close. Samuel loosened his collar, trying to process what he was hearing. "Did you recognize the man?" I think it was Patrick Sullivan. He'd been doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, fixing fences and such. Irish boy, no family to speak of. The kind of person who wouldn't be missed right away. And after that night you left?" Margaret nodded. "I packed my things and was gone before dawn. Didn't even wait for my final wages. I've been staying with my sister in Charlestown, but I'm thinking of leaving Boston altogether. This city, there's something rotten in it, and it starts with that house on Beacon Hill. Samuel slid the silver dollar across the table to her. Is there anything else? Any other details that might help me understand what's happening? Margaret pocketed the coin quickly, then leaned closer. There's a book. Mrs. Hargrove keeps it in her private study, locked in a cabinet behind her desk. It's old, bound in leather that looks almost black. She reads from it during the ceremonies. The words aren't in English, but they make the air feel thick, like before a thunderstorm. Have you ever seen the inside of this book? Once, when I was dusting, she'd left it open on her desk. The pages were covered in drawings, plants and symbols and other things that made me feel sick just looking at them. And there were lists of names written in different hands, like it had been passed down through generations. Samuel's mind raced with possibilities. A family grimoire, perhaps, containing instructions for whatever dark rituals the Hargroves had been practicing. Do you remember any of the names? Some were too faded to read, but I saw recent ones. Mary O'Brien was there, and Patrick Sullivan, and... She hesitated, fear creeping back into her voice. And what? There was a name at the bottom of the list written in fresh ink. Samuel Crowley. The blood drained from Samuel's face. That's impossible. I only started investigating yesterday. Mrs. Hargrove, she knows things, sees things. The other servants, they said she could tell when someone was asking questions about the family, even before they came to the house, like the garden itself whispered secrets to her. Samuel's hand instinctively went to his coat pocket, where he kept his notebook. Had he been marked for death simply by asking questions? The thought seemed absurd in the rational light of day, but Margaret's terror was genuine. There's one more thing, Margaret said, rising from the table. Tonight's the full moon. If you're planning to investigate further, that's when they'll be active. But Mr. Crowley, if you value your life, you'll leave Boston tonight and never look back. With that warning, she hurried from the tavern, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of dread. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a steady rain, and the grey sky seemed to press down on the city like a burial shroud. As he walked back toward his boarding house, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, every passerby a possible agent of the Hargrove family. But his journalist's instincts warred with his survival instincts. If what Margaret had told him was true, then the Hargroves were responsible for multiple murders, and the authorities were either complicit or willfully blind. The story of a lifetime lay before him, but it might cost him that very life to tell it. As the day wore on toward evening, Samuel found himself faced with an impossible choice. Flee Boston and let the killings continue, or stay and risk becoming the next victim to feed Eleanor Hargrove's macabre garden. The decision would have to be made soon. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, and with it came the promise of another full moon rising over Beacon Hill. As twilight descended over Boston, Samuel Crowley stood at his boarding house window, watching the gas lamps flicker to life along the cobblestone streets below. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the emerging stars. In a few hours, the full moon would rise, and with it, if Margaret Finch was to be believed, would come another night of horror in the Hargrove garden. Despite every rational instinct screaming at him to flee, Samuel had made his decision. He was a journalist, and this story, if he could survive to tell it, would expose a corruption that reached into the very heart of Boston's elite society. But he wouldn't go unprepared. His first stop had been to Father O'Malley at St. Stephen's Church in the North End. The elderly priest had listened to Samuel's carefully edited account with growing concern, eventually providing him with a small silver crucifix and a vial of holy water. "I've heard whispers about that family for years," the priest had admitted. "Nothing I could prove, but enough to make me uneasy. If you must do this thing, May God protect you." Samuel's second preparation had been more practical. A visit to a pawnshop had yielded a small but sharp knife, which now rested in his coat pocket alongside his notebook and pencil. He'd also purchased a small hand mirror and a length of rope, tools that might prove useful if he needed to observe without being seen or make a quick escape. Now, as the clock in the boarding house parlor chimed 9 o'clock, Samuel donned his darkest clothes and set out for Beacon Hill. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the city itself sensed the approaching evil. Even the usual sounds of evening revelry from the taverns seemed muted. The Hargrove mansion loomed against the night sky like a Gothic monument to wealth and power. Samuel approached from the side, where a narrow alley ran between the estate and the neighboring property. The iron fence here was lower, and ancient oak trees provided cover from the gas lamps on the main street. He'd studied the layout during his earlier reconnaissance, noting the position of the servants' quarters and the garden's relationship to the main house. According to Margaret's description, the mysterious cellar entrance would be somewhere near the center of the garden, hidden among the flower beds. Samuel scaled the fence with surprising ease, his years of climbing trees as a boy serving him well. He dropped silently into the garden, immediately struck by the overwhelming fragrance of the flowers. Even in the darkness, their colors seemed unnaturally vivid, as if lit from within by some internal fire. The garden was larger than it had appeared from the street, with winding paths that led through carefully cultivated sections of roses, lilies, and exotic plants he couldn't identify. At the center, just as Margaret had described, stood a circular clearing dominated by a massive oak tree whose gnarled branches seemed to reach toward the sky like supplicating arms. Samuel crept closer, using the larger flower beds as cover. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to make out details that chilled him to the bone. The soil around many of the plants was darker than it should be, with a rich, almost black quality that spoke of unnatural fertilization. And there, barely visible among the roses, were small white objects that looked disturbingly like bone fragments. A sound from the direction of the house made him freeze. The front door was opening, and figures were emerging onto the portico. Samuel quickly positioned himself behind a large rhododendron bush, using his small mirror to observe without exposing himself. Eleanor Hargrove led the procession, dressed in a flowing black robe that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Behind her came 4 other figures, also robed, their faces hidden by deep hoods. Samuel recognized none of them, but their bearing suggested wealth and education, members of Boston's elite who had gathered for purposes that would horrify their social peers. The group moved with practiced precision toward the center of the garden. As they approached the great oak, Samuel saw something that made his blood run cold. A section of the ground beneath the tree was opening, revealing a stone staircase that descended into darkness. The cellar Margaret had mentioned was not a conventional basement, but something far older and more sinister. Eleanor descended first, her robed companions following. Within moments, they emerged carrying items that confirmed Samuel's worst fears: iron shackles, ceremonial knives, and what appeared to be an ancient tome bound in leather so dark it seemed to drink in the moonlight. But it was the final figure they brought up from the depths that made Samuel's heart race with terror and pity. A young woman, barely out of her teens, stumbled between 2 of the robed figures. Her hands were bound, and a gag prevented her from crying out, but her eyes were wide with fear and desperate hope that someone might save her. Samuel recognized her from his research. Catherine Murphy, Thomas Murphy's niece, who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. The constables had dismissed her disappearance as another case of a young woman running off with a suitor, but here was the horrifying truth. The robed figures arranged themselves in a circle around the oak tree, with Eleanor at what appeared to be a natural altar formed by the tree's massive roots. Catherine was forced to her knees in the center, her terrified whimpers barely audible even in the garden's unnatural silence. Eleanor opened the ancient tome and began to read in a language that predated any Samuel had ever heard. The words seemed to crawl through the air like living things, making his skin crawl and his teeth ache. As she spoke, the flowers around the garden began to glow more brightly, their colors shifting and intensifying until they hurt to look at directly. The other robed figures joined in the chanting, their voices creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Samuel found himself fighting the urge to step forward, to join the circle, as if the very sound was designed to draw listeners into its web. Eleanor raised one of the ceremonial knives, its blade catching the moonlight and reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to move independently of the weapon itself. She approached Catherine, who struggled futilely against her bonds, tears streaming down her face. Samuel knew he had to act. Every instinct told him to flee, to save himself and report what he'd seen to the authorities. But he also knew that by the time help arrived, Catherine would be dead, and the evidence would be buried beneath the garden's unnatural beauty. Drawing his own knife, Samuel stepped from his hiding place. "Stop!" he called out, his voice carrying across the garden with surprising strength. The chanting ceased immediately, and all eyes turned toward him. Eleanor's face, visible now in the moonlight, showed no surprise, only a cold satisfaction, as if his appearance had been expected. "Mr. Samuel Crowley," she said, her voice carrying a cultured Boston accent that made her words all the more chilling. "How good of you to join us. I was beginning to think you might disappoint me." "Let the girl go," Samuel demanded, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Whatever you think you're accomplishing here, it's not worth an innocent life." Eleanor's laugh was like silver bells ringing in a cemetery. "Innocent? Oh, my dear Mr. Crowley, you understand so little. This garden has been fed by sacrifice for over 2 centuries. It was here before the city, before the English, before any European set foot on this continent. We are merely the current caretakers of something far older and more powerful than your limited imagination can grasp." The other robed figures had begun to move, slowly closing the circle to include Samuel in their ritual space. He realized with growing horror that his intervention had not saved Catherine. It had simply provided them with a second sacrifice. "The Hargrove family came to Boston in 1798, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a lecture. "But we did not build this garden. We found it, along with the knowledge of how to maintain it. The previous caretakers were less sophisticated in their methods. We have refined the process, made it more elegant, more sustainable." Samuel backed toward the fence, but found his way blocked by 2 of the robed figures. Their faces were still hidden, but he could see their hands now, pale, soft hands that belonged to Boston's wealthy elite, stained with blood from previous ceremonies. "You see, Mr. Crowley, this garden is not merely decorative. It is a conduit, a bridge between our world and realms of power that most humans cannot even conceive. The sacrifices we make here feed not just the plants, but something far greater. In return, we receive prosperity, influence, and protection from the mundane troubles that plague lesser families." The truth hit Samuel like a physical blow. The Hargrove fortune, their political connections, their seeming immunity from scandal, all of it was purchased with human blood, fed to whatever ancient power dwelt beneath the garden. "The city records," he gasped, understanding flooding through him. "The disappearances going back decades. It's all been you." "Not just us," Eleanor corrected. "The responsibility has been shared among Boston's finest families for generations. We take turns providing the necessary offerings, ensuring that no single household bears too great a burden. It is, you might say, a civic duty." The implications were staggering. Samuel realized he wasn't facing a single family of killers, but an entire network of Boston's elite, bound together by shared guilt and mutual benefit. The corruption ran deeper than he had ever imagined. Eleanor raised her knife again, this time pointing it towards Samuel. Your investigation has been most thorough, Mr. Crowley. It's a pity that your story will never see print, but your sacrifice, along with Miss Murphy's, will ensure another month of prosperity for our fair city. As the robed figures closed in, Samuel made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to fight his way out, he lunged toward Catherine, cutting her bonds with his knife and pulling the gag from her mouth. "Run!" he shouted, pushing her toward the fence. "Get to the police! Tell them everything!" Catherine stumbled but managed to regain her footing, sprinting toward the iron fence with the desperate speed of someone running for their life. The robed figures moved to intercept her, but Samuel threw himself at the nearest one, his knife finding flesh beneath the expensive fabric. The man cried out, a voice Samuel recognized as belonging to a prominent banker, and stumbled backward. The distraction was enough for Catherine to reach the fence and scramble over it, disappearing into the night. Eleanor's face contorted with rage. "You fool! Do you have any idea what you've done? The balance must be maintained." "The only thing I've done," Samuel panted, backing toward the oak tree, "is save an innocent life. And when she reaches the authorities, she will tell them a fantastic tale that no one will believe," Eleanor interrupted. "A hysterical young woman claiming that Boston's most respected families are practicing human sacrifice. They'll assume she's mad and lock her away. We've dealt with witnesses before, Mr. Crowley. Their testimonies rarely prove credible." Samuel realized with sinking heart that she was probably right. Without physical evidence, Catherine's story would be dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind. The conspiracy was too large, too well protected by wealth and influence. But as the robed figures surrounded him, Samuel noticed something that gave him a spark of hope. In his struggle with the banker, the man's hood had fallen back, revealing his face clearly in the moonlight. And Samuel's journalist's eye had captured every detail: the distinctive scar on his left cheek, the unusual shape of his nose, the expensive gold tooth that glinted when he grimaced in pain. If Samuel could survive this night, he would have at least one identifiable member of the conspiracy. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Eleanor raised her knife for the final time, her eyes reflecting the unnatural glow of the flowers around them. "Your death will feed the garden well, Mr. Crowley. Take comfort in knowing that your sacrifice serves a greater purpose." As the blade descended toward his heart, Samuel closed his eyes and prayed that somehow, someway, the truth would eventually come to light. The knife never found its mark. A thunderous crash echoed through the garden as the front door of the mansion burst open, followed by the sound of heavy boots on the portico steps. Shouts in Irish accents filled the night air, and the distinctive whistle of the Boston constabulary pierced the darkness. Eleanor Hargrove's face went white with shock and rage. "Impossible," she hissed, the ceremonial blade trembling in her grip. Through the garden paths came a force that Samuel had never expected to see. Thomas Murphy leading a group of Irish dock workers, all armed with clubs and work tools, followed closely by 3 constables with their brass buttons gleaming in the moonlight. At the rear of the group, Samuel spotted Catherine Murphy, her dress torn but her voice strong, as she pointed toward the ritual circle. "There, just as I told you, they were going to kill us both." The robed figures scattered like startled crows, their careful ceremony dissolving into chaos. 2 of them made for the cellar entrance, but Murphy's men were faster, tackling them to the ground before they could escape into whatever tunnels lay beneath the garden. Eleanor herself stood frozen for a moment, as if unable to comprehend how her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. Then, with a snarl of fury, she lunged at Samuel with the ceremonial knife. Samuel rolled aside, the blade missing him by inches and striking the oak tree's massive root. The impact sent a shudder through the ancient wood, and for a moment, the unnatural glow of the flowers flickered like candles in a strong wind. "Constable Morrison!" Samuel called out to the lead officer, a man he recognized from previous encounters while covering police matters for the Herald. "The evidence you need is in the cellar beneath this tree." Morrison, a practical man in his 50s who had seen enough of Boston's dark side to believe almost anything, nodded grimly. "Murphy, get some of your lads down there. And be careful, we don't know what we're dealing with." As the constables moved to secure the scene, Eleanor made one last desperate attempt to complete her ritual. She raised the knife again, this time pointing it toward her own heart. "The garden must be fed," she screamed, her cultured accent dissolving into something older and more primal. "The compact cannot be broken." But Thomas Murphy was quicker than his age suggested. His work-hardened fist connected with Eleanor's wrist, sending the knife spinning into the darkness. She collapsed to her knees, her black robes pooling around her like spilled ink. "The compact," she whispered, her voice now broken and defeated. 200 years, all for nothing. Samuel approached her carefully, his journalist's instincts overriding his fear. "What compact? What did your family agree to?" Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated guilt. "You want the truth, Mr. Crowley? The truth is that this city was built on blood and sacrifice. The Puritans thought they had claimed this land for God, but they never understood what was already here, sleeping beneath the soil." Constable Morrison had produced a pair of iron shackles and was securing Eleanor's hands, but he paused to listen. Even the hardened Irish workers had fallen silent, sensing that they were about to hear something that would change their understanding of their city forever. "My ancestor, Cornelius Hargrove, came to Boston in 1798, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the cadence of a confession. "He was fleeing debts in England, hoping to make a new start in America. He purchased this land cheaply because the previous owners were desperate to sell. They warned him about the garden, told him stories of strange lights and disappearances, but he dismissed them as superstition." Samuel pulled out his notebook, his hands shaking slightly as he began to record her words. This was the story he had come seeking, though he had never imagined it would be delivered under such circumstances. "The first winter was harsh," Eleanor went on. "Cornelius lost most of his money in failed investments, and the family was facing starvation. That's when he found the cellar and the books that had been left behind by the previous caretakers." "What books?" Morrison asked, his practical policeman's mind focusing on evidence. "Journals, mostly, written in a mixture of English and something older. They told the story of this place, how it had been a sacred site for the native tribes long before any European arrived. The ground here is different. Thinner, the barrier between our world and others is weak." From the cellar entrance came the sound of Murphy's men calling up their discoveries. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph!" one of them shouted. "You need to see this!" Morrison dispatched one of his constables to investigate while keeping his attention on Eleanor. "Continue, Mrs. Hargrove." The journals explained how to make contact with the entities that dwelt in the spaces between worlds. They required offerings, blood and life force, in exchange for prosperity and protection. The previous caretakers had been doing it for generations, but they had grown careless, taking too many people too quickly. The authorities had begun to notice. Samuel felt a chill as he realized the implications. "So your ancestor took over the responsibility." "He refined the process," Eleanor nodded, "made it more subtle, more sustainable. Instead of one family bearing the entire burden, he reached out to other prominent Boston families, sharing both the responsibility and the rewards. The Cabots, the Lowells, the Adamses, all of them became part of the compact." The constable returned from the cellar, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Sir," he reported to Morrison, "there's a chamber down there filled with remains, human bones, dozens of them, and books. Old books with writing I can't read, and—" He swallowed hard. "And fresh blood on the altar." Morrison's expression hardened. "How many families are involved in this conspiracy, Mrs. Hargrove?" Eleanor's laugh was bitter. "Conspiracy? Mr. Morrison, you're looking at the foundation of Boston's prosperity. Every major fortune in this city has been built on the compact. The shipping magnates, the textile barons, the political dynasties, All of them have fed the garden when their turn came. Samuel's mind raced as he considered the implications. If Eleanor was telling the truth, then the corruption reached into every level of Boston society. The mayor, the police chief, the newspaper owners, any of them could be part of the conspiracy. But something went wrong, he said, studying Eleanor's face. The disappearances became more frequent. You were taking too many people. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. The entities, they've been growing hungrier. The old compact specified one sacrifice per family per year, but lately they've been demanding more. The garden requires constant feeding now, and the flowers... She gestured toward the still glowing blooms around them. They've become addicted to human blood. Thomas Murphy, who had been listening with growing horror, stepped forward. "My niece," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was just the latest in a long line of innocents you've murdered." "Not murdered," Eleanor protested weakly. "Offered. There's a difference. Their deaths serve a greater purpose." Murphy's fist connected with her jaw, cutting off her words. "There's no greater purpose worth the life of an innocent child." Morrison restrained Murphy before he could strike again, but his own expression showed that he sympathized with the man's rage. "Mrs. Hargrove, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." "You have the right to..." "Rights," Eleanor laughed, blood trickling from her split lip. "You think your laws matter here? The compact is older than your constitution, older than your courts. The entities we serve don't recognize human authority." As if summoned by her words, a low rumbling began to emanate from the cellar. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly, and the flowers around the garden began to pulse with renewed intensity. "What's happening?" Morrison demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his service revolver. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "You've disrupted the ritual, but you haven't ended it. The entities are angry, Mr. Morrison. They've been promised blood, and they will have it one way or another." The rumbling grew stronger, and Samuel noticed that the oak tree's branches were beginning to sway, despite the absence of any wind. The very air around them seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. "We need to get everyone out of here," Samuel said urgently. "Whatever's down in that cellar, it's not going to stay there much longer." But even as he spoke, he realized that their troubles were far from over. Eleanor Hargrove might be in custody, but the conspiracy she had revealed involved some of the most powerful people in Boston. And if the entities she spoke of were real, then stopping the Hargrove family might have unleashed something far worse than human evil. The garden around them continued to pulse with unnatural life, and in the distance, Samuel could hear the sound of carriages approaching, reinforcements for either the constables or the conspirators. The night was far from over, and the true test of their survival was yet to come. As the ground beneath the oak tree began to crack and split, revealing glimpses of the ancient darkness that lay beneath, Samuel realized that his investigation had uncovered more than just a series of murders. He had stumbled upon a secret that threatened the very foundations of the city he called home, and the forces they had awakened might prove too powerful for any human authority to contain. The crack in the earth beneath the oak tree widened with each passing moment, releasing a stench that spoke of centuries of decay and something far worse, the smell of otherworldly corruption that made every person in the garden gag and recoil. From the depths came a sound that was neither animal nor human, but something that predated both. "Everyone back!" Constable Morrison shouted, drawing his revolver despite knowing that bullets would likely prove useless against whatever was emerging from the cellar. "Form a perimeter around the house." But even as the constables and Murphy's men began to retreat, more carriages were arriving at the mansion's front gates. Samuel's heart sank as he recognized the occupants, some of Boston's most prominent citizens, all arriving as if summoned by some prearranged signal. "The other families," Eleanor Hargrove said, her voice carrying despite her injuries. "They've felt the disruption. They're coming to restore the balance." Samuel counted at least a dozen carriages, their passengers emerging with the confident bearing of people accustomed to having their orders obeyed without question. He recognized Mayor Quincy, Police Chief Sullivan, and several members of the City Council. Behind them came figures he knew from the society pages, the Cabots, the Lowells, and other names that graced the most exclusive social registers. "Morrison!" Chief Sullivan called out as he approached the garden, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "Stand down immediately. You're interfering with matters beyond your jurisdiction." Morrison's face flushed with anger and confusion. "Chief, we've uncovered evidence of multiple murders. Mrs. Hargrove has confessed to..." "Mrs. Hargrove is clearly suffering from some form of mental breakdown," Mayor Quincy interrupted smoothly. "These wild tales of sacrifice and conspiracy are obviously the product of a disturbed mind. I'm sure a few days of rest in a proper medical facility will restore her to her senses." Samuel watched in horror as the conspiracy revealed itself in full. The arriving dignitaries weren't here to help. They were here to cover up the truth and eliminate any witnesses who might threaten their carefully maintained secret. "What about the evidence in the cellar?" Samuel demanded, stepping forward despite the obvious danger. "The bones, the altar, the books." Mayor Quincy's smile was cold and practiced. "Mr. Crowley, isn't it? I'm afraid you've allowed your imagination to run away with you. Old houses often have cellars filled with historical artifacts. I'm sure any bones you think you've seen are simply archaeological remnants from the colonial period." But even as the mayor spoke, the crack in the earth continued to widen, and the sounds from below grew more distinct. Whatever dwelt in the depths was responding to the disruption of the ritual, and it was not pleased. Thomas Murphy, his face set with grim determination, stepped beside Samuel. "You can spin your lies all you want," he said to the assembled dignitaries, "but my niece saw what happened here. She'll testify to the truth." "Will she?" Police Chief Sullivan asked with a meaningful look toward Catherine Murphy, who stood near the garden's edge. "Young women who've suffered traumatic experiences often have difficulty distinguishing between reality and nightmare. I'm sure the proper medical treatment will help her recover her clarity." The threat was unmistakable. Catherine would be declared mentally incompetent, her testimony dismissed, and any evidence would disappear into the bureaucratic machinery controlled by the conspiracy. Samuel felt the weight of his notebook in his pocket, pages filled with details that could expose the truth if he could survive to publish them. But surrounded by the most powerful people in Boston, his chances of leaving the garden alive seemed increasingly slim. That's when the ground beneath the oak tree finally gave way completely. What emerged from the depths defied easy description. It was shadow-given form, darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence. Tendrils of pure blackness writhed upward, reaching toward the moon, as if trying to blot out its light. And within that darkness, Samuel caught glimpses of something that might once have been human, but had been transformed by centuries of feeding on blood and pain. The assembled dignitaries fell silent, their political maneuvering forgotten in the face of the entity they had served for so long. Even Eleanor Hargrove seemed awed by the creature's presence, her earlier defiance replaced by something approaching religious reverence. "The feeder," she whispered. "It comes to claim what was promised." The entity's attention turned toward the humans gathered around its garden, and Samuel felt a pressure in his mind like nothing he had ever experienced. Images flooded his consciousness, visions of the creature's long history, its arrival in this place before human civilization, its patient cultivation of the garden that served as both altar and feeding ground. He saw the truth of Boston's founding, how the Puritan settlers had unknowingly built their city atop an ancient feeding ground. He witnessed the first tentative contacts between desperate colonists and the entity, the gradual development of the compact that had sustained both the creature and the city's elite for over 2 centuries. But he also saw something else. The entity's growing hunger, its increasing demands that had pushed the conspiracy to take more and more victims. The creature was no longer content with the careful, sustainable feeding that had characterized the early years of the compact. It wanted to gorge itself, to transform the entire city into its feeding ground. "It's not going to stop with just a few sacrifices," Samuel gasped, fighting against the mental pressure. "It wants everyone, the whole city." Mayor Quincy stepped forward, his political instincts overriding his fear. "Great One," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced supplicant, "we offer you these interlopers as compensation for the disrupted ritual. Take them, and we will restore the proper order." But the entity's response was not what the mayor expected. Instead of accepting the offered sacrifice, the creature's tendrils lashed out toward the assembled dignitaries, wrapping around several of them and lifting them into the air. Their screams echoed through the garden as they realized that their long partnership with the entity was coming to an end. "It's done with the compact," Eleanor Hargrove said, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and fascination. "We've served our purpose. Now it wants to feed freely." Samuel understood with horrible clarity what was happening. The entity had used the conspiracy to establish itself in the heart of Boston, to grow strong on the blood of carefully selected victims. But now it was powerful enough to dispense with human intermediaries. The city's elite had outlived their usefulness. Constable Morrison, showing more courage than Samuel would have expected, raised his revolver and fired at the creature. The bullets passed harmlessly through its shadowy form, but the gesture seemed to focus its attention on the remaining humans. "The cellar!" Samuel shouted to Morrison and Murphy. "If we can collapse the entrance, maybe we can trap it." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. While the entity was occupied with its former human servants, Samuel led a small group toward the cellar entrance. The stone steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light, but they could see enough to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. The chamber below was vast, carved from the living rock and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The walls were lined with alcoves containing human remains, some so old they had crumbled to dust, others fresh enough that Samuel could still smell the decay. At the center of the chamber stood an altar stained with centuries of blood, and around it lay the books and artifacts that had guided the conspiracy for generations. There, Murphy pointed to a series of wooden support beams that held up the chamber's ceiling. "If we can bring those down." They worked frantically, using their tools and weapons to weaken the supports while the sounds of chaos continued above them. Samuel could hear screams, both human and inhuman, as the entity continued its rampage through the garden. As the first support beam cracked and fell, Samuel grabbed one of the ancient books from the altar. If they survived this night, the world would need proof of what had happened here. The leather-bound tome felt warm to the touch, as if it contained some spark of the entity's power. The ceiling began to groan and shift as more supports gave way. "Time to go!" Morrison shouted, and they raced up the stone steps as the chamber collapsed behind them. They emerged into a garden transformed. The entity's feeding frenzy had drained the unnatural life from the flowers, leaving them withered and black. Several of the conspirators lay motionless on the ground, their bodies desiccated as if they had been mummified in moments. The creature itself seemed larger now, more solid, fed by the blood of its former servants. But the collapse of the cellar had clearly affected it. The entity writhed and contracted, its form becoming less stable as its connection to the underground chamber was severed. For the first time since it had emerged, Samuel sensed that it might be vulnerable. "The books!" Eleanor Hargrove screamed from where she lay, shackled near the oak tree. "You've destroyed the books. Without them, it can't maintain its hold on this realm." Samuel looked down at the tome in his hands, understanding flooding through him. The books weren't just records of the conspiracy. They were anchors, binding the entity to the physical world. By destroying them, they had begun to sever its connection to their reality. The entity seemed to realize this as well. Its attention turned towards Samuel with an intensity that made his knees buckle. He felt its alien intelligence probing his mind, searching for weaknesses, trying to break his will and reclaim the book he carried. But Samuel had spent his life pursuing truth, and he had seen too much tonight to be broken by fear. Instead of surrendering the book, he held it high and spoke the only words that seemed appropriate. "This ends now." With all his strength, he hurled the ancient tome into the dying embers of a gas lamp that had been knocked over during the chaos. The leather binding caught fire immediately, and as the flames consumed the pages, the entity let out a sound that was part scream, part roar, and part something that had no human equivalent. The creature's form began to waver and fade, its connection to the physical world weakening with each page that burned. The other survivors, Morrison, Murphy, Catherine, and a handful of constables and dock workers, watched in amazement as the shadow that had terrorized Boston for centuries finally began to dissipate. But even as it faded, the entity's voice echoed in their minds one final time. "This garden will remember. The hunger will return. What has been fed will feed again." Then it was gone, leaving only the smell of smoke and the withered remains of what had once been the most beautiful garden in Boston. As dawn broke over Beacon Hill, Samuel Crowley sat on the steps of the Hargrove mansion, writing in his notebook by the light of the rising sun. Around him, the survivors were giving their statements to the constables, while the bodies of the conspiracy's victims were being removed from the collapsed cellar. The story he would write would shake Boston to its foundations. The conspiracy had reached into every level of society, and its exposure would topple governments and destroy fortunes. But it was a story that needed to be told, no matter the cost. Eleanor Hargrove, now bound for trial, and almost certainly the gallows, had made one final confession as they led her away. "You think you've won, Mr. Crowley, but you've only delayed the inevitable. The garden remembers, and there are other cities, other families who know the old ways. The hunger never truly dies." Samuel closed his notebook and looked out over the withered garden. The flowers were dead, the oak tree was beginning to show signs of decay, and the mansion itself seemed to be aging before his eyes, as if the entity's departure had taken with it whatever unnatural force had preserved the estate. But Eleanor's words haunted him. If she was right, if there were other places like this, other conspiracies feeding ancient hungers, then his work was far from over. The story of the Hargrove garden was ending, but it might be just the first chapter in a much larger tale of horror that stretched across the entire country. As he walked away from Beacon Hill for the last time, Samuel Crowley carried with him not just the story of a lifetime, but the terrible knowledge that some evils were too old and too patient to be destroyed by a single night's work. The garden might be dead, but somewhere else in another city, another family might be tending their own patch of darkness, feeding their own ancient hunger. The sun rose fully over Boston, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. And in those shadows, Samuel could almost see the shape of horrors yet to be uncovered. His investigation was over, but his real work, exposing the darkness that lurked beneath America's growing prosperity, was just beginning. The macabre garden of the Hargroves had yielded its final harvest, but the seeds of evil, once planted, had a way of taking root in the most unexpected